The moment she walked through that restaurant door with her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, I knew my so-called friends had finally outdone themselves, because nothing says, hilarious prank, quite like humiliating a stranger who did absolutely nothing wrong. My name is Daniel, and 3 years ago I was the kind of man who let people push him around because keeping the peace felt easier than standing up for himself. I worked at a mid-sized logistics company in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business and gossip traveled faster than the delivery trucks we scheduled. My coworkers, a tight little circle of guys who called themselves my friends, had a habit of setting me up on blind dates as a running joke. It started small. A date with someone's cousin who turned out to be married. A date with a woman who spent the entire dinner talking about her ex. I laughed it off every time because I didn't want to be the guy who couldn't take a joke. But that night, the joke went further than any of them had planned, and none of us walked away from it unchanged. If you believe people deserve second chances, and if you believe kindness can change the direction of someone's entire life, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me you're watching, share this with someone who needs a reminder that good still exists in this world, and subscribe to the channel because these stories only get more powerful from here. Her name was Claire. I found that out later, because in that first moment all I could see was a woman maybe 7 months pregnant, wearing a soft gray sweater that did nothing to hide how visibly nervous she was, standing at the entrance of an upscale seafood restaurant that my coworkers had specifically chosen because they knew the tables were close together and the lighting was unflattering. Perfect conditions for cruelty to be filmed on someone's phone without anyone noticing. My coworker Brad had set the whole thing up through some dating app nonsense, creating a fake profile with my photos, chatting with random women for weeks under my name, and finally arranging a date with the first woman desperate enough or hopeful enough to say yes. Claire, it turned out, had no idea any of this was a joke. She thought she was meeting a kind man named Daniel who had spent 2 weeks texting her sweet, thoughtful messages, asking about her day, telling her he couldn't wait to meet her. Every one of those messages had actually come from Brad, typing on his phone during lunch breaks, laughing with the guys about how gullible this woman was, how desperate she must be to date while pregnant and alone. I didn't know any of this when she sat down across from me. All I knew was that 4 of my coworkers were sitting 2 tables away, phones angled toward us, barely containing their laughter, waiting for the moment I would either storm out in embarrassment or say something cruel enough to make her cry so they could post it online for cheap laughs. That was the plan. I found out about it fully only after the damage had already begun, but in that first minute, sitting across from a stranger who looked like she might dissolve into tears at any second, I understood enough to know something was deeply wrong, and that the joke, whatever its exact shape, was not funny at all. She barely looked at me. Her hands were folded on the table, her knuckles pale from how tightly she gripped them together, and when she finally lifted her eyes to mine, I saw something in them that I recognized immediately because I had felt it myself more times than I wanted to admit. It was the look of someone bracing for disappointment before it even arrived, the look of someone who had learned through hard experience that hope was a dangerous thing to carry. She apologized for being a few minutes late, explained that the bus had been delayed, and I noticed then that she didn't have a car, didn't have anyone waiting outside for her, had come alone to meet a man she believed had been genuinely interested in her for 2 weeks. Something in my chest twisted uncomfortably. I glanced toward my coworker's table and saw Brad grinning, giving me a thumbs up, mouthing the words, "Say something," as if this were a game show and I was supposed to perform on cue. In that instant, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a hot, clarifying anger, not at Claire, but at myself, for every single time I had gone along with something that felt wrong just to avoid conflict, for every time I had laughed at a joke that wasn't actually funny because laughing felt safer than objecting. I asked her if she wanted to order something to eat, and she hesitated before saying she wasn't very hungry, though I could see in the way her eyes flicked toward the menu that she absolutely was, and that the hesitation had nothing to do with appetite and everything to do with money, or pride, or both. I ordered for both of us without making a show of it, simple pasta dishes, nothing extravagant, and while we waited for the food, I asked her gently how she'd been doing, and that was when her composure finally cracked. She told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she probably shouldn't have come. She said it twice, actually, the second time so quietly I almost didn't catch it, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth instead of my face, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin. I asked her why, keeping my voice as soft as I could, and she explained that she'd been nervous all day, that she almost cancelled 3 times, that she felt foolish sitting across from a stranger while 7 months pregnant, worried he would take one look at her and regret ever agreeing to meet. She said the messages she'd received over the past 2 weeks had felt like the first genuinely kind thing to happen to her in longer than she cared to admit, and that she was terrified those messages had been a mistake, a fluke, something that would evaporate the moment reality set in. I felt sick. Not because of anything she had done, but because I understood in that moment exactly how much courage it had taken her to walk through that door, and how casually my coworkers had weaponized that courage for a laugh. She went on to tell me, hesitantly at first and then in a flood she seemed unable to stop, that the baby's father had left when she was 4 months along, packing a bag one evening while she was at a prenatal appointment and simply never coming back, not even for his belongings, which she eventually donated because looking at them every day felt like living inside an open wound. She said her own mother lived 3 states away and wasn't able to help much, that she was working part-time at a daycare center for as long as her body would allow it, saving every dollar she could for a crib and diapers and the 100 other things a baby needs that nobody warns you about until you're standing in a store aisle doing math in your head. She told me she had almost stopped believing that anyone could be kind to her without wanting something in return, and that the messages from Daniel had cracked open a door she thought had closed for good. Every word she said felt like a stone dropping into my stomach, because I knew, even as she spoke, that the man who had sent those messages was sitting 2 tables away laughing behind his hand, filming this conversation for entertainment. I had a choice in that moment, the kind of choice that doesn't announce itself as significant but that quietly determines the shape of everything that follows. I could keep going along with the joke, playing my assigned role, or I could tell her the truth and accept whatever consequences came with it. I told her the truth. I told her as gently as I possibly could, watching her face carefully for signs that she might bolt from the table, that the messages had not come from me, that a coworker of mine had created a fake account and orchestrated this entire meeting as a prank, and that I had only learned the details myself in the past several minutes. I watched her face go through disbelief, humiliation, and finally a kind of numb devastation that made me want to reach across the table and pull every single person at that other table out of their chairs. She started to stand up, murmuring an apology, telling me she needed to leave, and I understood in that moment that if I let her walk out that door alone into an Ohio evening with no car and no one waiting for her, I would be complicit in exactly the cruelty I claimed to be against. I asked her to stay, not because I wanted to salvage some twisted version of the date, but because I didn't want the last thing she experienced that night to be humiliation and running. I stood up instead, walked over to my coworkers' table, and told them, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear, exactly what I thought of what they had done. Brad tried to laugh it off, calling it harmless fun, and something in me that had stayed quiet for years finally found its voice. I told him there was nothing harmless about using a vulnerable, pregnant woman's hope as entertainment, that the fact that she had trusted those messages enough to show up alone said more about her decency than it ever would about their cruelty. The restaurant had gone quiet enough that other diners were watching, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't care who was watching or what they thought. When I turned back to Claire, she was still standing by the table, tears finally slipping down her cheeks, and instead of leaving, she sat back down, maybe because some small part of her recognized that what she was witnessing was different from what she'd expected. We ended up staying at that restaurant for almost 2 hours, long after my former friends had slunk out, embarrassed and quiet for once. She told me more about her pregnancy, about the fear of raising a child alone, about a dream she'd had since childhood of becoming a nurse that she'd shelved indefinitely because survival didn't leave room for dreams. I told her about my own life, about the promotion I'd been passed over for twice because I never advocated for myself, about a father who left when I was young in circumstances not so different from what she was living through now, though I'd been the child instead of the parent. We didn't talk like strangers by the end of that dinner. We talked like 2 people who had both been quietly surviving and had just discovered, almost by accident, that surviving felt lighter when shared. I offered to drive her home that night, and she accepted, and when we pulled up outside a modest apartment building on the edge of town, she sat in the car for a moment before thanking me, not for the dinner, but for telling her the truth instead of letting her find out some other way, or worse, never finding out at all and simply wondering for the rest of her life why Daniel had suddenly gone silent. I told her I'd like to see her again, genuinely, no jokes, no pranks, and she looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, a fragile, cautious hope, the same kind of hope I imagined she carried into that restaurant hours earlier, except this time it had somewhere real to land. Over the following months, I visited her more than either of us probably expected. I drove her to prenatal appointments when her schedule at the daycare made it hard to get there on her own. I helped assemble a crib that came with instructions clearly written by someone who had never actually assembled it themselves. I sat with her in a hospital waiting room during a scare at 34 weeks when her blood pressure spiked and doctors worried about early labor, and I remember gripping the arms of a plastic chair so hard my knuckles ached, realizing somewhere in that waiting room that my feelings for her had stopped being about guilt or obligation and had become something entirely different, something that felt dangerously close to love, not just for her, but for the small, unborn life she was carrying with such fierce determination. Her daughter was born on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 pounds and 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a cry that filled the entire delivery room with a kind of relief I had never experienced before. Claire asked me to be in the room, and I stood beside her, holding her hand through the hardest hours of her life, and when the nurse placed that baby girl in her arms, Claire looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and said that she never could have imagined, on that terrible, humiliating night in the restaurant, that it would somehow lead her here, to this moment, surrounded by someone who chose to stay instead of someone who had only pretended to. If this story has touched something in you, if you've ever needed someone to simply tell you the truth and stand beside you instead of walking away, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment sharing how it made you feel, and share it with someone in your life who could use a reminder that people can still choose kindness even when cruelty would be easier. We are still together today. Claire finished her nursing certification last spring, working night shifts at a hospital not far from where we live now, and her daughter, whom she named Hope, just celebrated her second birthday with a cake shaped like a sunflower because Claire said sunflowers always turn toward the light no matter how dark the sky gets. I think about that restaurant often, about how close I came to staying silent, about how easily that entire evening could have ended in humiliation instead of the beginning of everything good in my life since. I lost those coworkers as friends, and I've never once regretted it, because some friendships are only worth keeping if they never ask you to be cruel in exchange for belonging. Before I go, I want to ask you something important. If you have a moment, please leave a comment below telling me one word that describes how this story made you feel. I read every single comment, and knowing this story reached you and meant something means more to me than you know. What started as someone else's cruel joke became the truest, most important relationship of my life, proof that kindness offered at exactly the right moment can rewrite a story that seemed destined for pain, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply refuse to go along with cruelty, even when everyone around us insists it's harmless.